Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. If this is your first time here, do head on over to our YouTube page and subscribe and follow us as well on all social media platforms, as well as all the audio platforms, wherever you get your podcast. If this is your first time here, Strategy International is a global think tank that brings together great minds from all over the world to discuss, analyze, and research topics of global interest, such as international relations, policy, strategy, defense, economy, and much, much more. Of course, you can visit strategyinternational.org for all information and all the beautiful things that are being done over at Strategy International. Speaking of great minds, we have another great guest with us today, Dr. Khaled Alkassimi. He's an assistant professor of political science and international relations over at the American University in the Emirates, with particular expertise in international law and international relations, security studies and post-development studies, and finally, political philosophy. Khaled, how are you? Thank you for coming on to the program.
Thank you for having me, George.
It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. We don't often get the opportunity to discuss developments in the Arab world, so I'm really looking forward to picking your brain on different topics that are that have piqued our curiosity from all over the world. I want to start because I didn't know that you had published a book. Recently, you published a new book titled "International Law, Necropolitics and Arab Lives: The Legalization of Creative Chaos in Arabia." Immediately, there's a word that pops out that got me very curious. Necropolitics. What is necropolitics? Explain to the people that are watching or listening.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure. Before I start, I actually wanted to just say a few words in relation to Strategy International. We were pleased to have you as a strategic partner in our recent International Arab Security Gulf Conference, which went exceptionally well. This happened a few weeks ago in Dubai at AUE. So I just wanted to say that it's always a pleasure to have a think tank as prestigious as yours in representing and playing a part in the success of our conference. In relation to the book, specifically necropolitics as a concept, necropolitics by definition means the politics of death. Okay, so considering that it's been 20 years since the intervention or the conquest of Iraq, depending who side you're aligned with. The book started, or the concept itself was related to, usually politics is, the art of creating better possibilities for people, making them happier, and creating a better social life in general. But the book started from an aspect of, since 9/11, there's been a consistent politics that doesn't necessarily want to expand life, but is more interested in the proliferation of death. So that's what the concept means. And it's not necessarily a concept which I came up with. It's several philosophers such as Achilles Membe, I think he's from the Ivory Coast. He wrote a book called Necropolitics. And I used other philosophers such as Giorgio Agamben, who talks about the idea of biopolitics. So yeah, the concept itself was very important in actually pushing the argument that what has accented the Arab world since 9/11 is actually the politics of death and not the politics of life. Mm-hmm. And I can go into details if you would like, but that's pretty much what the concept is.
We're going to go through several concepts that you mentioned, notably the 20 years since the American invasion in Iraq and a few other important things that have been happening in the region. Before we get there, though, tell me, do you think that there is something, that the West hasn't fully understood about conducting relations in the Middle East?
That's a beautiful question. Yes, and I think in relation to international relations as a discipline which arose after World War I, World War II, um, which was an Anglo-American discipline. And any discipline arises from the specific epistemology of the day. So following World War I, World War II, the specific epistemology that accented the West or international relations was realism, realpolitik, which is, I'm sure our guests and you are aware of this, but I usually describe it as interests are more important than morals. So you do anything that actually advances your interest. And that has been historical. Most societies do advance, and most political communities advance and are interested in their interests. However, the Arab world, and I think this goes directly to your question, the Arab world is interested, obviously, in interests, but because it's an area that still values spirituality and religion. And when I say religion, I don't mean just Islam. I mean, Christianity, Judaism. Interests are not necessarily at the expense of morals. So the Arab world values the word, logos, right? They value the word is actually more important than the written word. Not to go back to Socrates and Muhammad, where they didn't really write anything, they just spoke. So the word was very valuable. And I think that's one of the things that the West doesn't necessarily, and when I say the West, I don't mean simply geography. I mean specifically the epistemology. So how does the West know what it knows? It's usually materialism. It's all about quantitative. It's not qualitative. So the Arab world, specifically valuing spirituality, I feel like that's something that has always escaped the West when it seeks to speak and come up with solutions and policies to the Middle East.
It's very interesting because when you're talking about the region, in the Middle East, there seems to always have been a time where the U.S. has always had a presence there, and we can argue whether that presence has been good or bad. But there have been many attempts at peacemaking, and arguably some less successful than others. And I just want to get to something that happened recently. The entire world was surprised when China seems to have brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily, well, obviously, because it's Iran and Saudi Arabia, two countries that had this long history of division.
Mm-hmm.
But more specifically because it was China and not the U.S. And I've been reading a lot of analysis and I've been listening to a lot of commentators. Is there a shift? Is there a shift happening? Is the U.S. losing the footing it's always had as an influential power in the region?
Okay, so when it comes to, and this is maybe the philosophy in me speaking, I usually look at the causes rather than the consequences. So the Iran Saudi China deal, or the United States seeming to be losing foot in the Arab region, that's a consequence. So what were the causes that created this new perception is something that I think needs to be dissected a bit, because the writing has been on the wall for the past 5 years. So specifically around the COVID kind of juncture, but even previously. So if we look at the causes, so what has been happening for the past 10 years? So if we look at 2001, 9/11, 2011, then 2003. If you draw a straight line between these three moments, or these three acts, right, you realize that there wasn't necessarily consultation, cooperation, or diplomacy between the United States and the Arab world. So there was simply our interest is this, and you have to follow suit, right? So here, this goes back to our idea of, well, if we're sovereign, then there should be a back and forth. There should be a dialogue. What is your interest? What is my interest? So the shift that has occurred in the past few years, and it's been crystallized with Xi Jinping meeting with Mohammed bin Salman and in Saudi Arabia recently. This might sound surprising to some to see, but if a person follows the developments that have been occurring for the past few years, it's somewhat of a natural development. And I want to say a few things about this. So what is interesting in what happened is, if you look at geopolitical shifts, they usually happen in two ways. There's the geopolitical shift, but there's also the ideational shift. And I think it's the ideational or the worldview that is more important. So the worldview of China is similar to the Arab world. China's Confucianist to some extent. Its political system is communist, but the social and what drives it is to some extent a form of Confucianism, right? Which is a religious garb, if you will. So if we go back to the ideational shift that has occurred, so there's two, if you want, worldviews that have been clashing for the past few years. There's the one that's led by the United States, which some people call the unipolar liberal worldview, and then there's the Russian Chinese, if you want, worldview, which is a multipolar, conservative, sovereign-based worldview. Okay, so I want to say a few words if possible on this, and it might take like a few minutes if possible.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay, so the Chinese have specifically emphasized. So there's the ULG, the unipolar liberal worldview, that's clashing with the multipolar conservative worldview. The Arabs fall under the MCS, the multipolar conservative worldview. They align with that, right? And that's because China does not necessarily think that there's one civilization or one path to modernity and everybody should follow suit. Okay, they believe there's multiple civilizations and there's differences, and it is through differences that we can actually develop a more cohesive, cooperative international system. This clashes with the unipolar liberal worldview, which, if you want, since World War II has been dominating the international system. One form of development, one civilization, and the Gulf region, the GCC, and the Arab world in general have realized in the past few years that their idea of belonging, their society, their civilization has been perceived as, in some aspects, inferior to the liberal civilization. And we see this more specifically, let's say, in the World Cup, how the World Cup was kind of broadcasted internationally. While it did occur in Qatar, it was perceived as the Arabs not necessarily having understood what it means to be civilized or liberal because of their own conservative worldview. So China actually developed this idea of Global Civilization Initiative, the GCI. And the GCI has been, I recommend the viewers to actually read the initiative itself. It's a very inclusive form of perceiving, it's a very inclusive form of seeing different civilizations. So there's not necessarily a clash of civilizations, but more of a dialogue of civilizations. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the president of the UAE, has on several moments emphasized the importance of engaging in a dialogue between civilizations. So, and that actually goes against, if you want, the unipolar liberal worldview. So, as you said, there's obviously always going to be a clash between these two because it's not in the interest of some powers to have a multipolar world, while in some cases it's in the interest of some to have a unipolar world. So this clash exists. So I feel like that's why there's a shift. It's not necessarily that the United States is leaving the Middle East or the Arab world, but we do see a realignment of partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the interesting aspect. The meeting between Xi Jinping and Saudi Arabia occurred before the meeting with Xi Jinping and President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, what happened in Saudi Arabia is a natural continuation to what happened in Moscow, because it could have been the reverse, but it's not a coincidence that it was a natural continuation, and that goes back to the Belt and Road Initiative that China has and that over 20 Arab countries have actually signed off on in the past few years. So the BRI is a very important geopolitical and civilizational project. It's in the interest, obviously, of these powers and these countries to engage in that because they want development, economic development, but they also want to exchange and engage in a dialogue between different civilizations. And I think that's the crux of the argument. So if we look at what happened, for instance, in the Saudi Iran deal, could I speak about that, or did you want to?
Yeah. It was my next question. I mean, if there's anything more that we know, aside from the fact that at least so far they seem to just want to reestablish diplomatic ties, which obviously hasn't happened yet. I mean, they gave themselves a window, but aside from that, I mean, what more do we know?
Okay, so one thing that people aren't necessarily aware of is that it is actually Pakistan last year, in 2022, in March, during the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. This was actually the first time that, or one of the first times that Iran was part of the OIC. And it was actually Pakistan who actually initiated this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this actually happened last year, and the instigator was actually Pakistan. If you want, China took the mantle and established it more specifically, but it was actually the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which actually initiated this step. So there's obviously a litmus test, if you will. The reconciliation, as you said, I think the window was 2 months. In 2 months, they'll open the embassies, and the litmus test will be how Iran will react in areas that it's involved in through militias, so whether it's Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, where there's obviously a proxy war happening. But the benefit of this rapprochement is not simply Saudi Arabia, Iran. It's actually it's on a global geopolitical plane. So for instance, Pakistan hasn't had its peace gas pipeline initiative restored until recently. So Pakistan's peace gas pipeline initiative was actually halted because there was a lot of differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the project actually stalled until recently. Now, for those who are not aware of what the peace gas pipeline is, there's actually a Russian, Iran, India trade route project that has been in the works for the past few years, and it's called the International North-South Transport Corridor, which is the INSTC. And this actually connects the GCC, the Gulf, to that. So there's a lot of Eurasian mega projects which are linked to this transport corridor. So this rapprochement between, China, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it might appear like it's two adversaries coming together, but it's also more than that. It's, the Belt and Road Initiative project that China's involved in. It needs to have stability in these countries so these mega projects can actually go through.
Mm-hmm.
So there's benefits for the GCC, there's benefits for Pakistan, there's benefits for obviously China, Russia, India. So having a détente, if you will, or a rapprochement between these two powers will create stability security guarantees in these regions so these projects can actually go through. And these projects are multi-billion-dollar projects. So that's one aspect that I think people need to also focus on. And there's something that a lot of Arabs are speaking about right now called the Asian century. Okay, so this deal kind of instigates or reinitiates the Asian century, which has been dormant for the past.
What's the Asian century?
The Asian century, if you will, is this idea, if we go back to, the unipolar liberal worldview and the multipolar conservative worldview, it's this idea that these two worldviews can live together, okay, with their differences, but allowing the Asian countries to actually develop on their own, And when I say on their own, this is not to say that cut ties with the West, but develop based on our own civilizational characteristics. So the Asian century is this idea where, since the establishment of this international system during the Bretton Woods Conference and all of these kind of architectures that have, if you want, disabled the development of the Arab world, the Asian century allows countries that are from different religious persuasions, different ethnicities, different civilizations to actually develop on their own path, okay, at their own in their own way, if you will. And this goes back to the idea where, and this actually goes back directly to the Global Civilization Initiative of China, where we can all develop following our own and respecting our own identities and cultures without having, specific media corporations or specific organizations sanctioning our development because we're going in a different way. Right. Okay, so go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit, because back to the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, obviously, like we're saying, it's still at a very early stage. Of course, we don't know how things will progress. Definitely, there's many moving parts that depend on this to work out. But assuming everything falls into place and, knowing the influence that Saudi Arabia has in the region, is there any potential for this deal to destabilize any progress or alliance that has been made through the Abraham Accords, for example?
Well, so the Abrahamic Accords, or the Abraham Accords, obviously Saudi Arabia has not signed on to it. Now, in the past few weeks, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, has said that our whole objective was to isolate Iran. And here we have one of our major, one of the closest allies of the United States, sitting and signing a diplomatic treaty. So with Saudi Arabia, opening diplomatic relations or hoping to reopen diplomatic relations with Iran, that has kind of isolated Israel. Now, Saudi Arabia has said that we will normalize relations with you, and we wouldn't mind signing the Abrahamic Accords or engaging in these relations, but there's there are two requirements. One, we want a civil nuclear projects, right? And two, we want to make sure that the Arab Peace Summit that happened in 2002, the clauses in it need to be respected. So for those who are not aware about what happened in the Arab League Summit in Beirut in 2002, the communique of the summit itself said, return to 1967 borders, two-state solution, capital Jerusalem, 3, the right of return for Palestinians. Okay, so that's the position of Saudi Arabia. Okay, but more specifically, Saudi Arabia is saying we'll normalize relations, but if you give us a peaceful nuclear technology. obviously Israel is against that. And the United States does not really seem to be flirting with that idea. But I don't necessarily think that that Saudi Arabia is doing this. Saudi Arabia is increasing. It's going to the extreme. Israel and the United States didn't necessarily think that Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Iran, but the fact that it did, it's now hedging both sides against each other, right? It's placing the bet on both. So Saudi Arabia wants to inform the United States that when Iran bombed Aramco a few years ago, when Iran bombed Abu Dhabi, the airport, or maybe not Iran, I need to be more specific. The drones that were directed by the Houthis in Yemen, right? Those were the ones who bombed. But again, we know who Ansarullah got their weapons from. So at that moment, the United States was supposed to retaliate or help Saudi Arabia retaliate against Iran. That didn't happen. So interest would dictate that if this is not going to happen, so if you're no longer the strategic partner that actually helps or defends me, well, I'm going to look outward. I'm going to look to other allies. And this is where I guess people can realize that for the past few years, the United States has been removing itself from the strategic architecture of the Arab world. And this is where China comes in. It comes in from economic interest. It comes in from China is building factories that allow ballistic missiles in Saudi Arabia. So there is, a variety of weapon contracts and weapon projects that are occurring in Saudi Arabia, which 10, 20 years ago would have been unthinkable. So the Abrahamic Accords is, and I don't necessarily look at consequences, I look at causes. The Abrahamic Accord is not simply the normalization of relations. It's more than simply that. There's like a trinity when it comes to that. Excuse my metaphor. So there's the Abrahamic Accords, there's the Abrahamic religion, and there's the Abrahamic path. Okay, most people just know the Abrahamic Accord, but the Abrahamic Accord is a long-term project. Okay, for you to have the Abrahamic Accord, the clauses in it established, you need to, and this takes like 10, 20 to 30 years, because the whole point of the Accord is to put a final curtain call on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, this does not simply occur with you signing a peace treaty, because it's also the mindset of Arabs in general, including Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So here you have the entry of the Abrahamic path. And if you want, I can share with you the studies that have been done from the University of Florida and University of Harvard on why did they call it Abrahamic, right? What's the point of Abraham in this whole idea? So not to go into too much detail, the Abrahamic religion, which is some sort of new religion that specific scholars are talking about, when Harvard actually sent specific researchers into the Levant, so they didn't meet with governments, they actually met with people, like normal citizens. And they said, what is one thing that, you have in similarity to Israel? They said, Abraham. Abraham is the patriarch. We all believe in Abraham. Okay. So this study started back in the 90s. Then it picked up speed in 2003, and more specifically 2014. So Abraham becomes this, if you want, this person where you can now, in the long run, if you want, neutralize the Arab-Israeli conflict. But that is not sufficient, because Christians know their theology, Muslims know their theology, and Jews know their theology. So in addition to that, you have the Abrahamic path. What is the Abrahamic path? It's this area where Abraham, peace be upon him, traveled during his prophecy. So it starts from Iraq, goes into Palestine, Syria, then it goes into what we call today Saudi Arabia. So the Abrahamic path, according to Israeli policymakers, they want to create a tourist attraction area. This has not been established yet, but it's part of the whole Abrahamic Accord, if you want, project. So the Abrahamic path is a tourist attraction area where all people of this region could go on this tourist attraction area and actually familiarize themselves with the similarities between Israelis, Arabs, etc. And in the long run, because everybody realizes that we're all, cousins, we're all related, we can all go to our different places of worship, that in the long run, if you want, neutralizes the Arab-Israeli conflict. Okay, so, but again, when Jared Kushner was asked in 2019, what is the goal of the Abrahamic Accords? He quote unquote said, the goal is to remove the political borders of the Arab world. So that obviously brings up another question. So what happens to the idea of sovereignty? So is the Abrahamic Accords a project where you are seeking to remove sovereignty of Arab countries and you just keep Israel as the main sovereign entity? Another aspect of the Abrahamic Accords was all places of worship become museums. So I can, as a Muslim, I can go to the Church of the Sepulchre where Jesus was born, and I should be allowed to enter. That's not necessarily ethical from a Christian perspective, just like a Muslim wouldn't necessarily think it ethical for a non-Muslim to enter the mosque, right? Because we're from different religions, and that's beautiful. That's the whole beauty of the Arab world, or the variety of religions. So all this is to say that obviously the GCC, Saudi Arabia, all the countries that signed off on the Abrahamic Accords, they're aware of that. When they signed on the Abrahamic Accords, it was from a genuine, we do want to solve this issue, which is killing people from multiple religious persuasions. I don't think the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran and China is gonna diminish that. I just do think that Israel is now in a situation where it hasn't been since 1948, where its main partners, which it hedged its bets on to keep, the constructive chaos going in the Middle East, and now has to kind of realign its priorities. And maybe that's why the government right now is in Israel. It's one of the most right-wing governments, and that shows you anxiety. They're in a very anxious situation right now. So the Abrahamic Accords was a way for the Arab countries to bound Israel through international law. So they bounded it. So now when the UAE goes into the Security Council, because now it has a temporary seat, it can actually negotiate and tell Israel, you're violating international law because we have a peace treaty. Before the Abrahamic Accords, Israel can say, well, we're in a state of war, so why would I listen to you? Right. So now the Abrahamic Accords, you actually bounded Israel in international law. And I think that's the genius of the GCC in making that move, right? It's bounding the country called Israel in international law. Even though it's violated several of the clauses in the Abrahamic Accords related to settlements, the places of worship, all of these have been violated. So technically, the Abrahamic Accords has been violated by one party, while the other party is pushing Israel to abide by it.
Interesting. I want to move on to Iraq. You did allude to that a little bit earlier on.
Mhm.
I think every major news outlet in the world has been a reportage about the 20 years since the U.S. invasion, an invasion which we found out later on was based on a lie. The weapons of mass destruction, through Colin Powell's own statement at the UN. But it did topple a regime that was led by a dictator. Where are we 20 years later? Has there really been any progress? From the invasion and from the insurgencies and from the different, sectarian civil wars, from fighting ISIS. Has there even been any time to focus on rebuilding? Like, where are we 20 years later?
Uh, this is actually interesting because we're talking about the rapprochement between China, Saudi, and Iran, right? So in hindsight, the Iraq war was about establishing a new Middle East, right? That was kind of the go-to word that everybody spoke about in 2001, right? There's a new Middle East. Um, Condoleezza Rice is known, and this is actually how I start off the book. When Condoleezza Rice was asked, so what do you think about all the destruction happening in the Middle East? She was asked that in 2006. She said, I think the destruction in the Middle East is the birth pangs of a new Middle East. In other words, destruction is necessary to birth a new Middle East that is similar in civilization and society to the West. Now, 20 years,
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's happened though.
no,
Yeah.
right? But that's the interesting. So 20 years in hindsight, what you have was not, you have a new Middle East where it's not the United States that is directing it. You now have China that actually entered and is actually mitigating between these two um, uh, rivalries. So what has changed? This is like a huge thought. I know you said we only have like 40 minutes, but
Oh, you can take your time. Don't worry. I mean, we can stay as long
so
as you want.
So if we look at what happened in 2003, and this is something that I actually teach my students, we tend to say that the Iraq War was a war. It was actually not a war. It was a preemptive war, right? And in 2003, there was the reformulation of international law. Okay, and I'm gonna have to take a few minutes to discuss what I mean by that. So if we recall, in 2003, there was something called the preemptive defense strategy, PEDS. This was the first time in international law where you had this concept where I could bomb a country even though that country does not pose an imminent threat. So usually, according to international law, country A bombs country B if country B launched an attack, so I can retaliate. So here we understand the importance of the weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein having links with Al Qaeda, which was all based on flawed intelligence. But what we realize is these narratives were important to advance a preemptive war. So, in other words, it was not about Iraq having weapons or not. It was about the thought of Iraq possibly having weapons that made this war legal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is the argument that I adhere to. I don't think the United States thought that Iraq had weapons or not. It was just the new law, and there's a lot written on this preemptive defense strategy. For you to advance preemptive defense strategy, you need to have a narrative, a pretext to advance it. So the pretext at that point was the Iraq government is funding Al Qaeda. Iraq might use these weapons of mass destruction to target its people or the West. So automatically, this activates the preemptive defense legal clause and it allows the country to intervene in the country. So the Iraq war, in hindsight, was not a war, it was a preemptive war. That's why a lot of people were not tried for it because it was a legal war.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, putting aside the atrocities that happened, but it just shows you the problem of the international system, where you can advance a war legally without actually having evidence, but simply information. So 20 years on, we noticed that the laws that were developed after 2001 were not only used for the Iraq War, but also for what happened post 2011. So for those who don't know, Operation Inherent Justice that NATO activated to bomb Yemen, Mosul, parts in Syria was also preemptive defense strategy, where they were actually legally allowed to bomb areas, even though there were a lot of civilians and infrastructure under the auspices that there are terrorist groups there. So again, preemptive defense. So now, what I'm saying is these legal doctrines in hindsight have actually been recycled and reused in several contexts, whether in 2003, whether more recently in the past 10 years. And these laws have been very useful in expanding necropolitics, the politics of death. Okay. So going back to your question, what has changed? What has changed is when the United States allied with Iran in 2003 to topple the president of the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein, Iran was also okay with the constitution that was put in place, which was a ticking bomb, right? You pretty much divided the whole country based on Shias, Kurds, and Sunnis. So people weren't necessarily part of a national Iraqi identity. They were part of a sectarian national identity. Right. So 20 years from now, we can now see that, well, here you have Saudi Arabia and Iran sitting at a table, and it's not a coincidence that this meeting happened in the same month where the 20-year kind of celebration or the 20-year anniversary since the Iraqi invasion. So we can see that a lot has changed. And while the United States wanted a new Middle East headed by kind of a U.S. hegemony, we now have a new Middle East that is multipolar. Okay, it seems that Iran will be removing its militias from Syria, and this goes back to the President Bashar al-Assad visiting the UAE a few weeks ago. There are talks that the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia will be visiting Damascus in the next few weeks. President Bashar al-Assad will be traveling to different Arab countries, one of them being Algeria. He already went to Oman a few weeks ago. So it seems like the United States wanting to cloister Arab countries and have them, if you will, busy with sectarian violence, which did occur, right? It seems that that has reached a dead end, because the two main, if you want, regional powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have reached a point where this Sunni Shi'i kind of conflict, which I don't necessarily like calling it that because it makes it seem that Islam excuses terrorism, but it just seems that they've realized that none of them actually won.
Right.
None of them actually reached anything that they wanted. So it was like the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. You know, the Gulf and Saudi Arabia were huge funders on the Iraqi side against Iran. Nothing really happened. It actually created more animosity. In the 90s, Saudi Arabia breaks off relations with Iran. 2016, the Saudi embassy in Tehran gets pretty much ransacked. So the only, and this is something that I've been talking about with a few of my colleagues, the only solution left to this problem is diplomacy. They tried sanctions, they tried war, they tried proxy war, and it seems that diplomacy and sitting at the table is the final solution.
But when we're talking about Iraq specifically, and we look internally, I looked around. I mean, like we said before, there's so many things coming out now, to highlight this 20-year mark since the invasion, and there's a lot of stuff pertaining to democracy. I mean, they're more Western media sources, and as far as democracy goes, since 2003, since the invasion, there have been 6 elections, 8 different governments, 7 different prime ministers, some that we had never seen before in Iraq. The elections have been held on time, although Freedom House, still rates Iraq as, not free. I think in 2023, in the most recent rating, they still rate it as not free. But there's other indicators as well that we know from these indicators that there have been certain major improvements and accomplishments. We know that the Human Index indicator from the UN, there's different statistics where we know that the life expectancy is better. I mean, it added, I think, 5 or 6 years. GDP per capita is up almost 6 times. There are these indicators that seem to indicate that things are kind of improving. But does that paint the full picture of Iraq and the significant challenges that perhaps it still faces 20 years later?
You're absolutely right. These qualitative indicators are superficial. So if a person actually goes on right now and checks the GDP indicators of Lebanon, they seem pretty stable, right? But we all know that Lebanon right now is in a very bad shape. So when we go back to the Iraq example, since 2003, Iraq hasn't been a nation. And I think that's why these indicators don't really make sense. Iraq has been divided into, if you want 3 different sovereignties in Iraq. They have the Kurds who claim sovereignty in one part, you have the Shias, then you have the Sunnis who are just like outsiders in a way. So, and there's also the idea where most of Iranian products that come from Iran into Iraq, they created, they don't allow competition. So anything that's locally produced in Iraq does not have any lifeline because you have cheap Iranian products entering. You also have the idea of most oil revenue for the past 10 years. I think the number is around like $500 billion worth of oil revenue that has been unaccounted for. We don't really know where it went, according to the story, but it's obviously it's capital flight. Some of it went to endorsing the Iranian economy. So there's a lot of things. Like, I don't necessarily want to talk about what the United States did wrong, because a person can read the 3rd chapter of my book for that. But disbanding the army under Paul Bremer was a huge mistake that created animosity. Because when you remove an army, what you're really trying to say is that this country is no longer sovereign. It becomes a colony, right? Liquidating all ministries, but just keeping the oil ministry is also a problem. Devaluing the currency, ransacking the central bank, all of these things created a situation where Iraq was simply up for grabs. And the countries that grabbed it are the United States and Iran. Okay, and as you said, while the indicators might show progress, on the ground there isn't water, there isn't the basic developments, there isn't water, there isn't electricity. Brain drain has occurred for the past 10 years, and I think this is one of the major importance of the Saudi-Iran deal, because Arabs are aware that Iraq is not a place that is living up to its potential. And you need to have a negotiation and a dialogue between Iran and the Arab countries. And this has been happening for the past 2 years. There was the Amman dialogue, there was the Baghdad dialogue, you had the Prime Minister of Iraq attending Riyadh last year. So democracy is not, some people see democracy as a government style. it seems that democracy is more of a culture. Like, are you democratic? Are you liberal? Are you secular? Uh, are you willing to shed away your identity and your culture and become something else? Obviously, this will create a lot of problems internally because you can't forcibly eject a society from its natural historical development. And when you do that through war, through private military contractors, by forcibly displacing people, by using unconventional weapons, let's say in Fallujah or what have you, you create animosity. When you start targeting mosques based on different persuasions, whether Shia mosques or Sunni mosques, or over 3 million Christians have left Iraq, right? So this cultural mosaic that Iraq had has been, in the name of democracy, actually created a highly undemocratic environment,
Right.
right? So we can't forget the importance of this mosaic of cultures and religions in Iraq, which has subsided in the past 10, 15 years. I think there's only around 200,000 Christians right now in Iraq, which is
Yeah.
a sad story because the beauty of the Arab world is through this multiplicity of religions and ethnicities. And I think since 2003, there's been a systematic, if you want, liquidation of this civilizational heritage that we are proud of. And it's not only Arabs that made that possible, right? It's, the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, um, all of these groups living together for centuries has created this beautiful cultural a brilliance, right, which has decomposed slowly through, the war on terror kind of narrative, Arabs being terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in hindsight, it seems that we're attempting through diplomacy to remedy that dark page. So yeah.
In our exchange while we were preparing for the podcast, you mentioned to me that you wouldn't mind talking about the importance of a non-Western approach to international relations and law, and it immediately piqued my interest because for someone like me, born and raised in Canada and kind of fully immersed in Western principles, rights and freedoms, gender equality, open and free democratic elections, free market economy, privatization, and all these things. All principles, by the way, that have been equally adopted but in other parts of the world.
Right.
It feels like this Western approach to international relations and law is probably the more beneficial way. In your opinion, what in that approach doesn't or hasn't worked with countries in the Arab world?
Well, for us to understand international relations as a discipline, we also need to understand the discipline that arose right beside it, which is international law. So when I teach international relations, I actually have a week that informs the students about the law that dictates relations amongst foreign countries. So if realism is the approach of international relations, interests over morals, the natural school of law, which makes that possible, interest being more important than morals, is positivist jurisprudence. What is positivist jurisprudence? It's the idea that law is different than morality. Okay? So this might sound very confusing, but let me explain. So the Arabs, and specifically Muslims, we don't separate between law and morality. Anything that is legal, by definition, has to be moral. Okay? What you had, for instance, in the Iraq War was a legal war, but it was immoral.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to what you said, it was based on factless, baseless evidence. But The international system that has developed since World War II allows these developments to occur under the auspices of law. Okay, so when I say we need a new approach to international relations or a non-Western approach,
Yeah,
what I
what does that?
mean is,
What does that entail? What does a non-Western approach entail? And how, in your opinion, could it serve a better purpose, especially in that region?
right, so in that region, we already see its indicators. So diplomacy, cooperation, consultation, engaging in dialogue, which is not necessarily um, a Western approach to international relations sees diplomacy as a means to an end. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Diplomacy, by definition, should be an end, not a means. So realism, because it's based on interests over morals, I'll align myself with George today because it's in my interest. But 2-3 years from now, if it's no longer in my interest, I can now break away that alliance. An Arab or a non-Western approach to international relations would say that diplomacy is an end, it's not a means. So when Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed attended Moscow a few months ago, and he sat with President Putin, um, that development itself, which is diplomacy, it's an Arab approach to international relations, which is it's in the interest of all peoples, Ukrainian, Russians, there's people dying from both sides. So if we value human life from a spiritual perspective, not from an ethnic perspective or a nationalist perspective or a religious perspective, war should end. War should be an exception, not the norm. A realist approach to international relations or a Western approach sees war as the norm, peace as the exception.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because the system which has developed since World War II, and I don't really have the time to get into the philosophy behind it and the epistemology, because I would have to go back to like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment period, which is a very heavy, which we can talk about maybe inshallah in the future if you're going to have me again.
For sure.
Right. So a non-Western approach is simply allowing spirituality into the discussion. So there's an Arab saying which says, the third person in any negotiation is God. Okay.
I don't want to interrupt you, but it's interesting that you're mentioning
Yeah.
this because if we go back to those Western principles that I just mentioned and how they've also been adopted in other parts of the world, in many
Mhm.
of these cases, it is countries where we've clearly seen a separation between religion, church, and the state. Um, is that
Right.
something that comes into play, for example, in the Arab world?
Yeah, like I think Arabs in general, just that region, they appreciate their religious and spiritual heritage, and they don't necessarily separate religion from their political and social um, exercises, right? So, you know, I was actually speaking to one of my friends at McMaster University. He's actually one of my mentors during my PhD, Professor Nibaldo Gaigios, and he always told me that the West loves conducting economic deals with Arabs because they never go back on their word, right?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because this goes back to interest and morals. Like we balance between these two, right? We're not necessarily you're my friend today and you're my enemy tomorrow. And this is something in diplomacy called high context and low context negotiation styles. Arabs are high context. So when you and I are speaking, I'll make sure that I listen to your words. I'm not explicit, I'm implicit. I'm I look at body language. I'm not imperative in my demands because by definition, if you're imperative in a negotiation, then it's not necessarily diplomacy, right?
Mhm.
Um, so and that goes back to not because we're Muslim or whatever, because Arabs are not Muslim. Arabs are Christian, Muslim, Jews, and others. It's just part of our epistemology. When we look at the world, we don't necessarily see it as materialistic. That's why there's never been a red communist flag in the Arab world, And that's why there's never been a liberal capitalist government either. We take from these two whatever we think is beneficial, because the West is beautiful, right? There's beautiness and ugliness in every society, especially in the Arab world, especially in the West. There's beauty and ugliness, or good and evil, in every part of the world. But one thing that we're not necessarily willing to compromise on is our spiritual predisposition. And that dictates our political relations with countries and how we like to be perceived, right? And I think the World Cup made that clear as well. A person could be any sexual, they can adopt any sexual leaning that they want. That's up to you. But to now make it seem like if you don't adopt Western values, that means you're inferior or uncivil or violating democratic norms, that becomes an issue, because we are a different civilization, a different identity, a different people.
It's very, very interesting. You're a busy guy, and I know I've taken way more time from your schedule than we should have. But it was a very interesting discussion, and I want to thank you for that. And again, I just want to remind everyone to visit strategyinternational.org. Check out all the beautiful things that are being done over there, and of course, all the social media platforms, especially YouTube. You can see all the webinars that Strategy International has organized, and they're up there for you to get informed and educated. Khaled, thank you so much. It was a very interesting discussion, and perhaps we should have another one on the topics that you want, and we can. I can go on forever, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing your knowledge to our listeners and to our viewers.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care.